Thank you. It's great to be here at the Asia Society. Great to see a few familiar faces in the audience, and great to be with some familiar faces here as well. We're going to discuss the political, economic, and social changes that have taken place since COVID, and the changes in perceptions of the Chinese leadership, the changes in Chinese society. I mean, the whole world is transformed since 2020, of course, but I think no place perhaps more than where the pandemic started in China. And we're going to start with the politics. Obviously, all of these forces interact, political, economic, and social change, have interacted and overlapped with each other, as you'll see as we discuss over the next 90 minutes these things. So Lynette, can you start with the political implications?
Sure, political implications of COVID. So I think a lot of people would think, COVID is actually over. But if we kind of carefully think about kind of the sequence of events pre and post COVID and how I would say, the decline in Xi Jinping's regime has dropped after that, we can think about COVID. It's a bit like COVID to Xi Jinping could be described as a great leap forward to Mao. I mean, that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but both are very wrong-headed policies that the great leaders, both great leaders, have decided to hang on to them for way too long. And they had to abandon abruptly for a range of reasons. So, if we think about it in the framework of, exit, voice, and loyalty, I think there has been an exit of human capital, people, as well as financial capital out of China after COVID. There has been a move of middle class to Singapore, to Tokyo, to Toronto, where I'm based. There's also an influx of illegal Chinese immigrants into southern U.S. border and now residing in Flushing, New York. Exodus of them in the last couple of years. They came typically through Ecuador, because Ecuador is the country that allows the Chinese to enter visa-free, and they trekked through the jungle, risked their lives, and finally, arrived in the United States. But the numbers have actually stopped recently because Ecuador has stopped the Chinese from coming in without a visa. So you have to wonder why there's an increased number of people that have decided to leave China for a range of reasons, political, economic, and social reasons. There's also a flight of capital. A lot of companies are moving out of China, relocation of supply chains out of China into Singapore, Southeast Asia, and a range of other countries. So there's actually capital controls in China. So you wonder how people get their money out. There's a very interesting investigative article published some time ago that talks about crime syndicates involved in fentanyl trade in the United States and how they have this parallel network that work with underground bankers and financiers in China. So if you want to move money out, you cannot move money out, but you work with, so people here work with the crime syndicates, and people in China work with underground banks. Somehow they shake your hand under the table that allows you to move money out. So a range of stuff. So I see COVID as a very significant event, and we are now seeing its medium-term implications playing out, and I think its long-term implications is actually yet to be defined.
Thank you. And we're going to go through some opening remarks like this, and then I'll ask some follow-ups. In the last, half an hour or 20 minutes, we're definitely going to open it up to you guys. So get your questions in mind. So for Scott, we're going to go to you next with the economic implications.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be back at the Asia Society and the Center for China Analysis, which does great work, and enjoy having a conversation with everyone this morning. The way my research method is called jet lag. So I get on airplanes, which are increasingly expensive, and then go try to travel around China and places where Chinese do business to try and figure out, what is the pulse. And it turns out that there's pulses, plural, and it depends where you go, and it's very difficult to get the full picture. So we're always looking through that lens. It's also I was in China at the tail end of the pandemic, and so got to enjoy parts of the exit. There are people here who got to enjoy more of it than me, who should weigh in as well. But it's difficult to isolate specifically the consequence of the pandemic from the other factors shaping the economy. So I took the initial question to mean more is, in terms of the shadow of the pandemic plus other factors in the post-pandemic era, what does China's economy feel like? I wrote a report in 2017 called The Fat Tech Dragon, because I had visited a bunch of Chinese companies, and I thought, these are pretty impressive companies, but there's a lot of waste, very inefficient. So I've part of my recent travels has gone back to visit some of these companies and new companies, and then try and put the picture together. And so I don't think China's a fat tech dragon anymore. I think it's a slow tech dragon. And I would tell you, the companies that I visited this year and last year, way more impressive than when I saw them 8 years ago. EV companies, battery companies, AI firms, solar, their business strategies, their technology, their actual R&D, not just real estate investment. Very, very serious companies who know where they are, they know their strengths, their weaknesses, and genuinely impressive. And if you just go on streets in China, you can't but bump into an EV every 10 seconds. And they're amazingly, these are seriously good vehicles. And you see in shipping and satellites in many sectors progress. China's rankings in the Global Innovation Index has gone up. They're 12th now. And the percent of value added in supply chains, global supply chains from China, Chinese firms is increasing quite a bit. And that is all very impressive. So that's the tech dragon side. It's more powerful than it was. On the other hand, the economy is growing very slowly. For a variety of reasons. Part of it is the focus on technology, which is, I guess in the post-COVID era, what are you going to do to generate growth, right? And if real estate isn't going to be your driver for growth, you've got to find something else. And so all of this money going into tech, and there's too much money going into tech, into specific industries, and so you have overinvestment in certain sectors and overcapacity. And 200 Chinese EV companies, 5 making money, right? So you've got a lot of unprofitable investment. You also have failures. So people know about EVs, but there's lots of sectors that are failing. Semiconductors has not really borne fruit yet. China's commercial aircraft investments really haven't borne fruit yet. And we could play a parlor game for every one tech success you could mention. I could give you 2 failures. We could do that for a few hours if you wanted. Obviously, real estate and housing is still on its back with no signs of turnaround. Consumption is down. But the biggest sign of doldrums in the economy is confidence. There's all these physical measures, but the confidence is what you know when you talk to people, the lack of confidence. You see that abroad when you go to New York and Miami and you talk to institutional investors who've all hit the sell button. You see it when you talk to multinational companies when they have decided to diversify and not add new money into China. We just published a survey on Monday of Taiwanese companies and the proportion of them that are shifting some of their operations out of China, going to India and Southeast Asia. But it's even more impressive and startling talking to Chinese who have always been optimistic, always thought that next year would be better, expectations of increasing benefits. And it may just be, I just hang out with rich people because they're funner, and that they are skeptical and they are nervous. But they are quite pessimistic, and they're doing what Lynette said. But it's not just them. We published a study that was done by Scott Rozelle and Marty White in July. Marty had for a long time looked at popular attitudes towards inequality and had found that Chinese had recognized there's inequality, but said they were to blame or were responsible for the situation. So if they were poor, they would say, I'm not very smart, I'm lazy, that's why I'm not doing as well as others. If they were wealthy, they'd say, I'm smart, I work hard, it's because of me. So people sort of accepted the social Darwin explanation for inequality. The survey that they did last year, things have flipped. People now, if they're doing badly, it's the system. The system is screwing them. The system is unfair. If they're doing well, they know how to manipulate the system. So the sense of that the system is now an unfair system that either you figure out how to use or no, that is changed dramatically. And so it's not just the fact that I hang out with certain kinds of people. This is a broader thing. It's not everybody. You go to certain cities, certain types of groups of people, you hear lots of optimism and patriotism of progress. But it's been a shift. And I think the last thing I just want to leave you with, and probably we'll come back to this, is what will change? What will this change? There's a discussion about peak China and folks that believe that there's structural impediments in the economy, that it will never get better because of demography and debt. But I think we ought to bore down at some point in that conversation, because things, what would we need to see change? China just had a third plenum in July, obviously trying to promote the idea that they're aggressively tackling these issues. Will that be enough? What about China's relationship with the rest of the world? What about preparations for dealing and avoiding the next pandemic? Those are all things which I think we need to grapple with to see, is the current sense of malaise going to be with us for a while, or what would turn it around?
Fascinating stuff, and I think that leads well into Qin's work, because you've hung out with the people who maybe Scott's not hanging out with, and you can tell us about their what state they're in.
Thank
Please.
you so much, Scott. Next time, come with me. So happy to be here at the Asia Society, and so wonderful to be with my peer panelists. Thank you, Lynette, for putting it together. We are talking about a heavy topic. And my comments really follow Lynette and Scott's very well. So I want to focus on the livelihood and health and mental health of the Chinese people since COVID. The first point I want to make is that nearly everyone's livelihood has taken a hit, and that is along the income distribution. The poor people who I study so much, certainly you see them facing unemployment, disruptions to their income flow, many having uncertainties about future, where the next paycheck will be coming from. Along the middle of the income distribution, a lot of people still have stable jobs, but they are tightening their budget. I've met many people during my recent trip who saw their income decline by a third in that range. And a direct consequence is they are not spending money. They are only spending on what's necessary, which includes a very robust expenditure on child care and child education. And at the top of the income distribution, as Lynette and Scott already talked about, people also saw a decline in their income, wealth, investment. So a lot of people are leaving. People who are in China have difficulties in generating additional income. For example, a lot of people who are homeowners may need to sell their homes, but they are facing challenges selling them, or the prices are just too low. Another consequence of this is the rich people who own businesses have to cut their businesses, lay off people, and that feed into this cycle of a lot of people losing jobs, losing their income source. So this whole ecosystem of the economy is affecting everyone's livelihood. Second point, as we mentioned, consumption is down. People are only spending what they absolutely have to, and they are actually saving more given the limited resources because they are uncertain about the future, what new income sources or stable income sources they could have. One example is interesting. I learned on the ground. I was talking to a dentist, and they saw it firsthand. So only the people who definitely need a treatment, they are suffering, they will come and seek treatment. But people who need to do preventive care, people who need to beautify their teeth, they are not coming anymore. So the patient flow has been declining very steadily, and that actually worries the dentists and the nurses whose incomes are directly affected. The third point is what we already talked about, mental health. Unlike Scott, I don't deal with jet lag so well, so my approach was I went to China, rented an apartment for 2 months, and stayed there, relocated my family. So we were very much settled there for the summer period. And then in between, we traveled around. I visited 16 different stops, big cities, small cities, rural areas. Everybody I spoke to was anxious, uncertain about the future, not knowing what will come next. That is a sharp contrast from before, every time I traveled, certainly before COVID. So this bleak picture of the mental state of this large population across age groups, by gender, across rural urban areas, is really worrisome. Unfortunately, I don't see much being done by the government or by a large entity. The private businesses are increasing in this field. A lot of our graduates in social work, in psychology, are having new businesses, seeing a lot of patients. But it's a worrisome crisis that probably is partially the consequence of the COVID pandemic crisis. One group that is significantly affected by all the things I've said are the youth. So they don't find jobs. They are so uncertain and worrisome about the future. So a lot of the youth I talk to are preparing for tests after their college graduation, or 1 or 2 years before their college graduation. They are preparing to either take the test into a graduate school, 考研, or they are trying to become a civil servant, 考公. So those paths are very narrow. The competition is fierce, and it takes a few years for one to prepare and succeed. And as a consequence, the parents of these young people are also very tense and worried. They have to continue feeding them, also pep them about studying and preparing for the test, and they also don't know what the future holds. So that is very concerning, and with all the economic, political, health factors overlay in this group, which is the future of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Qin. Very interesting. I was struck, I wanted to ask about all three of you, about the implications of everything all three of you have said for perceptions of Xi Jinping and the central government. I was, and the Communist Party, I was struck especially by the survey data Scott talked about, because about them blaming the system if something went wrong. In my reporting days in China, it was you could almost count on people who felt that they'd been done wrong or were in a bad state to perhaps blame local officials and corruption, but they would almost to a person say, if only an equivalent of if only the emperor knew, if only Hu Jintao knew, or Wen Jiabao, or Xi Jinping, if he knew what was going on here, this would get fixed. And now it seems like things have changed dramatically on that front. and that's pretty important for the regime's legitimacy, for morale under the Communist Party, rule. So I was wondering if you could all three address that. And I don't know who wants to start. Maybe
Sure,
Lynette.
Sure. So that's an interesting point, because usually there is trust in local governments, according to a lot of surveys, are actually typically is quite high in China, but around 70-75%. But trust in the central government is extremely high, usually around 90%. Well, depending on whether you believe that people will indicate their true preferences, right? But let's leave that aside for a minute. There's a gap between trust in central government, which is much higher than local governments. But the thing with zero COVID policies is that I think the great leader hold on to it as his baby, that it was very difficult to turn it around. So typically when there's bad policies going on in China, because you have these different levels of government, it is very easy to blame it on the local government, such as Wuhan outbreak. Wuhan officials, when the virus first broke out, they actually did inform the central government, but they did not do anything about it. And when Li Wenliang, the whistleblower, there was an online outrage on Weibo, the central government then turned it around and blamed it on Wuhan local officials not doing enough to save the situation, and portrayed themselves as the savior. So that's kind of usually the game played between central and local government. But as you see, like the zero COVID policies was reversed very suddenly, right after the white paper protest in end of December, beginning of January, and then there was no reason given, right? And then you have empty shelves of medicines, and people couldn't get medical supplies. So I think that actually, so when I talk to people in Flushing who came here illegally, zero COVID was a huge reason. I mean, like what Gady said earlier, people felt that the government has failed them, and this is the central government has failed to save their lives, has failed kind of to protect basic livelihood and the series of consequences. But there's also a reversal throughout the course of the pandemic. I think in the first 1.5 years, China actually did pretty well. 2.5 years, from 2020 to the summer of 2022, that I think we have to give China the credit for. The lockdown initially worked very well because of the nature of the virus. They could then point to 1 million deaths in the United States, that democracies are not actually able to save people's lives as well as the Chinese Communist Party did. But then when the virus mutated and it was difficult to contain, Xi Jinping kept on holding zero COVID policies too tightly until it was impossible to contain anymore. And then sudden reversal, and I think that was actually the mistake, I would say. So to address your question, there is a sharp decline in the faith in the central government from what I have seen in my research.
And Scott, we've seen that too in the economic realm too, right? With economic policy, obviously it was quite some stunning decisions made over the last few years. Can you talk? Maybe you can talk about that.
I mean, I think just to add to what Lynette has said, I think that China's had an amazing run, right, of several decades. It's not been a straight line, but when they've run into problems or made mistakes, the party has had a learning curve, and you've seen adjustments. And I think what comes up from the last few years is that run seems to be over of straight luck, and the question of how well they learn and adapt. And also it's very clear that there's a lot less information. You're a reporter, you've covered China for a while, you know it's hard to understand what happens inside that system. It is even more difficult to know what's going on inside the system. And where power lays and how decisions are made. And as a result, that just leads to a lot of guessing and a lot of, well, we think this is what the leadership must think. This must be what Xi Jinping's views are, or whatever, people guessing. And so when you talk to people, there is just a lot of guessing, like, what do they know? What do they not know? Are they being kept in the dark? And that's just something that people ask because they're like, well, if they knew, if they only knew, they obviously wouldn't do what they're doing. And then there's people who just say, well, maybe they do have full information, but there's a competence gap. And these just are not the right folks, and they're not tackling the problems in the right way. And it really came in it's really sort of February, March of 2022. They did not respond to Omicron the way others responded to Omicron in the neighborhood, which was South Korea, Japan, realized they couldn't keep it controlled any longer. And they ended their own versions of zero COVID, but China stuck with it longer. And so that 8 months of doing something that just seemed against physics was shocking to people. And then they did this about face in literally 5 minutes, when there had been a bunch of studies by China's public health community about how you would gradually, effectively transition out of zero COVID. They ignored those proposals and just snapped their fingers and said, good luck, you're on your own. And that was shocking as well. And all the attention was on Shanghai. And Shanghai is a small place. It's only got 30 million people, and out of 1.4 billion. But if you're not from Shanghai, you know someone in Shanghai. And so that just had, I think, a huge effect on people's perceptions of this system. And then it's just compounded since. And they've not been able to modify the economic policies and restore confidence in a way that has led people to go back to thinking, you know what, we had this positive trajectory pre-COVID, and we're back on track. And so it's not that all of the economic policies are wrong. They just haven't coalesced into something that really grabs people and is changing behavior. So hence the high savings rates, private companies sitting on their money, people lying down, laying low, or leaving. And while on the other hand, from outside, it looks like China is like romping over the world with electric vehicles and everything. And there are some, plenty of people in China who think, you know what, we just don't get it yet. They're smart, they're doing the right policies, they're trying to squeeze the bubble out of the real estate market and prepare for the long term. And we don't get it. We're using Western biases or things like that, and then eventually we'll come around to them. That's I think a prominent view from people who think they're doing the right thing, even though it's not bearing fruit yet. So this is so there is that debate everywhere, and it's unlike anything that I've seen before COVID.
And Qin, you've been in people's homes over the course of a couple months in different towns and cities, and I wonder whether you're seeing that consistently an attitude about the central government or Xi Jinping in particular, if they'll talk about him, and also whether it maybe varies a little bit based on whether locally there was a crippling lockdown. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what you found?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. To answer your question, it was shocking to me, two things. One, I didn't have to probe. People would tell me what's on their minds. And partly because I visited a lot of people who are old friends, long-term contacts. Partly they see me as an outsider who they can trust and share their real thoughts. The other is across these vastly different localities, the voices are very unanimous. So for me, I see the Chinese government as a parent. The Chinese government has always been very paternalist, and people accepted that. But now the parent is losing the trust and respect of the children. One, let's say the people, the children don't think the parent care about them so much anymore. I think as we cited the previous surveys, people felt the government can make some mistakes, but still care about us, have our best interests in the heart. But that is disappearing. For example, this summer when I was there was a new wave of COVID, but there was no alarm, no any special care or increase in facility or professionals to treat it. So I think the sentiment of, okay, the government is doing a good job, hard work, the government cares about us, we will do everything to make our lives better in this COVID backdrop, I think that's disappearing. That speaks to the trust issue. The other is a good parent needs to let the kids try things, make mistakes, innovate, be creative. And that's how China became rich, right? The opening up and the economic reforms gave the room for many people to experiment, do their own things, and they became rich. China became rich. That's the miracle in the past 30, 40 years. Now that room of creativity, autonomy is so small. So all the people I talk to, civil servants, business people, professors, feel they cannot do anything wrong. Otherwise, someone else will catch them and they're going to be disciplined or punished. That's not great for the people to be creative. You have to allow room for autonomy, for trying different things. And that is what you mentioned. The anti-corruption campaign has been so fierce that people are worried about being caught, even by doing what they are supposed to do. There's a recent piece of news which is almost laughable. 2 days ago, it was the Chinese Teachers' Festival, Teachers' Holiday, September 10th. A teacher was accused of accepting a box of chocolate priced at 6 renminbi, 6 yuan, and was punished. And that's the extent of how there's no room for any kind of misbehaving. That's $1, yes. So, and received from a student. So that is one example of how all the people I spoke to, government officials, business people, professors, who are just going to watch carefully, do what they can do, and not be caught of wrongdoings.
And if I could just add to that, on top of anti-corruption, which has been going on for a decade, is this priority being placed on security. So financial security, economic security, academic security. So no matter what your profession is, you could be a scholar at the top universities, you could be a financial planner, you could be a banker. Now your priority is actually security, not your actual job. So imagine what it does to people's incentives and their willingness to take risks, to perform well in your job. Because at the end of the day, if you failed in security, if there's a major protest, online complaint against you, protests and things like that, you eventually lose your position. So professors in China, the top concern is actually not the students' performance, but whether or not the students would actually report on them. If they use Western textbooks, if they talk about Western ideologies more than communist ideology.
Now, you mentioned that you're sort of pessimistic in the medium term and maybe uncertain about the long term. But could you tell me, though, do you perceive, Lynette, and I throw this to the other two panelists as well, that the Chinese leadership has learned anything from everything you've just described in these last couple of years? How aware or how sort of self-aware are they? And do you have any sense of that?
So my sense is, as Scott mentioned earlier, there's a great deal of information asymmetry going on in China. I think that has always been the case because there is no election, there's no public opinion poll. But I mean, in relative terms, before Xi Jinping, I think the central government still, there's a feedback loop that people in the Politburo could take pulses of the society one way or the other. I think that sort of feedback loop is actually declining for many, many reasons. And one reason is with a very strong centralization of power, and the leader wants to hear what he wants to hear. And that is actually, I think, very much reflected through COVID. You do wonder why, you do wonder whether people close to him would actually dare to go up to him and say what is actually happening on the ground. And again, I draw parallel with the Great Leap Forward. It may be an exaggeration, but I think there are kind of parallels in logic. That things are going wrong. Zero COVID policy is not working, but people, and you have companies moving out of China, but people may not dare go up to the leader and say that things are not going right. Maybe we want to think about certain policies. Until things went terribly wrong, students start protesting, holding white papers, and things get out of control, and then things get changed very quickly about face in 5 minutes. So I think the intrinsic nature of the system that is the problem here.
Do you want to add anything to that, Scott, from what you see?
Yeah. My sense is that the folks running China have way more information about how China works than we do. They've got lots of different reporting lines. They conduct surveys that we don't get to see, but there are people doing surveys that are giving that information about attitudes. Sure. And I'm not sure whether the data in those surveys tell them the full picture, but nevertheless, they're doing that. And they read and listen to what the rest of the world is saying as well, from scholars to bankers to others. So there is a massive amount of information inside that system. Now, how it's interpreted is a totally different question, but that they are information light, I'd be quite surprised. It seems to me that their view is we have no choice but to pursue the strategy we're pursuing, right? We've got our relationship with the West has gone south because of Trump and who's followed. And so providers of technology, finance, markets aren't going to provide that. So we've got to do that ourselves. There was a series of color revolutions. Everyone else has changed. We're the last target standing. So we have to protect our political system. So we're under siege. And so that yields a kind of economic and political strategy that they've pursued in which everything becomes securitized. And then you kind of get this self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, you get slower growth in that, and you get more debt, and you get people anxious. I do think that they do have some sort of learning curve, but it's a delayed one. And it takes things to get worse before they decide to shift. COVID is the most extreme. They had to have things go totally off the charts and have protests in bunches of cities with people holding up blank pieces of paper to get the message that this was uncontrollable. With economic policy, you do see in the third plenum decision a recognition that there are severe problems, and they've tried to bring back the language of the Deng era. Kaifang, reform and opening, is used more now than ever in that document, and you see it in the media. You see them talk about the need to inject positive energy, zheng nengliang, into the system and get people more positive, and promises of this policy and that policy, like changing the hukou system and things like that. But people are still waiting for it to actually land and to make a difference. And so their behavior is still the behavior of people who don't have great expectations about the future.
Qin, is that what you've seen in terms of it, that language is familiar, or perhaps they're happy to hear it, but is it resonating or restoring any sort of faith amongst some of the people you're talking to?
Yeah, I think resonating, sure. The people recognize, so the people in the system know what's going on. How much of that goes to the very top, we don't know. I believe what Lynette was saying, like during the Great Leap Forward, how much the top leader knows, we would never know. But I think the large picture could be very much like an empress new clothing, that we see a different picture. And a lot of people who are in the system may not dare to tell the whole truth to their leaders. But I think the narrative is right. The opening up and the reforms, they just need to be translated into action. People need to see things happening. So one example is I was in Hangzhou, this great, beautiful international city, but no longer that international. I didn't see a lot of foreigners, and the cab drivers, the shop owners were saying, this is a totally different era, and that cuts their income sources. If we see a lot of businesses flowing, if we see the room for innovation, for, let's say, making some mistakes, I think people will change their thought because they need it.
Well, that leads me to my next question for all three of you, which is, what do you think it would take to restore confidence, and what are the policy or economic signals you'd need to see? That could either be signals from Beijing or signals in the economic data, Scott. What would you be looking for to show you, to give you the sense that things are turning around or might or could turn around? And I don't know if Lynette, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. I would like to see the number of registration of private businesses. I would like to see that growing. FT had a big read on the death of venture capital sector in China. There are some commentators on the internet saying that some of the numbers are exaggerated. There's a huge decline. But in spite of that, we have no doubt that that is very much in decline. The reason is not only the economy, but politics that has to do with Xi Jinping's and the Chinese Communist Party's view of private capital. That there is now an advancement of state-owned enterprises, and private sector is very much squeezed out and in retreat. So I think if I could see the numbers of private businesses registration going up, I think that would be a good sign. I think that to me could be followed by inflows of capital coming into China, there's also been a capital flight. On the social and political front, coming down on youth unemployment, there are controversy about how youth unemployment is actually measured. But a lot of youth unemployment could be due to they know that they couldn't find a job, and therefore they go registered in another degree, in addition to the existing degree, so they are registered as not having a job. But even so, people's prospect, like what Qin said earlier, is very much negative. Even people in top universities, they used to think they could go out to the top private sector. That would be their ideal job. If you graduate with an MPP from Tsinghua, for instance. But now their top position is actually securing a bureaucratic position with the government, because that is a guaranteed, iron rice bowl. So I think things are changing, but those are the indicators that I will be looking for.
What's interesting about that, and I'll get to the other panelists in a second, but I interviewed someone who was taking the civil service exam some years ago, and it used to be, back then it was sort of a declining appeal of the iron rice bowl because of the anti-corruption campaign, right? You weren't going to be able to get the extra rents that you get as a local official. But even if that campaign has been successful, certainly, or at least reducing the perception that you're going to get rents, it's interesting now that in relative terms, the iron rice bowl is appealing, has become even more appealing. That says something about the nature of the state of the Chinese economy, or at least the perception and confidence in it. Scott, what signals would you be looking for?
Yeah, I think there's a debate in China and amongst China watchers is there anything that the leadership can do right now with this leadership that would sufficiently shift expectations, or do you need a change in leadership, and only that change in leadership, that would be the signal that things would be potentially changing. And I honestly don't know what that is, but if you put that to the side, you know, you need to see a series of policies that don't say we're going back to the 80s and 90s. That's, you know, China's its economy is in a different place, the world is in a different place. You're not gonna see that, but you can see a greater shift toward genuinely accepting market mechanisms to allocate resources, private business really being embraced. I think if they did something like announce that the anti-corruption campaign has succeeded, and they don't need an anti-corruption campaign. One of the things that the anti-corruption campaign for 10 years has confirmed in people's mind is there's a lot of corruption. So announce that it's succeeded and move on. That would help. If they permitted more IPOs, the number of IPOs in China has dropped dramatically lately. And that has given the sense that it's very difficult to raise money for private companies to do things that they'd want to do, whether it fits with industrial policy or not. Open up the information taps more. Probably this is a wacky idea, and occasionally I come up with wacky ideas because that's just me.
Like declaring that corruption has been solved.
Exactly. So one more is, you know, the Great Firewall is needed by Chinese leaders' views, because if Chinese people had more information, they'd realize how bad things are, and they wouldn't accept the narrative. I actually don't think that's true. I actually think Chinese already go around the Great Firewall. They're pretty darn well informed, and the existence of it actually just undermines their sense that the official system's news is not right. So some way of modifying, lowering, tweaking, adjusting the way information is managed in China, I think would have a surprisingly constructive effect on people's faith. Even if they didn't agree with the official view, they now would have more legitimacy to have a conversation about those. So all of these things are about sort of pulling back and giving more space. I think another question is, when will we know that these hold? And it may be we'll see private investment go up, which is lagged behind state-owned investment. That's one of, sort of from an economic view, I think a key metric. Another is we'll see buying of first-time homes, new homes, go up. Right now, the secondary market for homes is high, but if people are buying that first home that hasn't been built yet, that would show confidence. And I think the third would be more births, people having more kids. And if they did that, that's the ultimate commitment that you think the future is going in the right direction. Because now you think, I'm going to invest for the next couple decades and in a future. So I think those are the kind of things on the policy side, and then what you'd want to see in terms of behavior.
But to be fair, I think fertility rates are declining across East Asia, right? So it's not only a China problem.
Reversing fertility rates is a pretty hard one. Elon Musk is working on that here as well. Actually, and speaking of which, your note about the Great Firewall was funny to me, because I was just imagining if Chinese people saw the actual discourse amongst Americans on X, they would actually realize that the propaganda is underselling how, kind of screwed up we are here in our public discourse. So maybe you have a point there. And Qin, I think the answer Scott, as he's said to me before, is like kind of giving an answer that institutional investors in Miami are looking for, or crypto bros. And obviously the answer for what would restore confidence, what signals to look for, will be very different from the folks you're talking to.
Thank you. And Scott, I don't think you will see many more new babies. So that will be a long and almost impossible wait for you. On the anti-corruption campaign, one thing I learned in this trip, which is interesting, is people are worried, concerned, that's afraid to be caught. But at the same time, corruption was a useful channel. A number of people told me, used to be if you give some bribes, they don't have to be big, you could make some connections and achieve some goals or get new opportunities. But now those channels are gone. The only people who could get ahead is those people who have family backgrounds, connections, which is partly Marty White's report was saying, family connections. So that further privileges the elite. So that's an interesting angle which I learned on the ground. What would I like to see happen? I think just two things. One, give people some money. It's not hard to do, and it's happening elsewhere in the world, especially when we study poverty, people who are at the lower end of the income distribution. It's not too costly to give people cash, and they will have confidence. Now I have a steady income flow I could spend. I could invest in my children. I could solve my next health problem, things like that. There's actually a book called Just Give Money to the Poor, and that will bring back a lot of confidence and also trust in the government. Another thing I would like to see, which is very hard, I don't know if it will happen, is for China to show some goodwill, maybe sacrifice some political dignity and build some friends internationally, such as the US or other countries. I know it's very hard to do, but somebody needs to take the first step and do it, because these tense US-China relations and other tense international happenings are affecting the Chinese people's livelihood. And it's only the government that's maybe gaining, but the people are not gaining. So I would like to see that happen.
Well, that's something we haven't touched on much, is the geopolitical positioning here, and there has been no signal of China kind of moving in that direction. It's more been towards a war economy footing or war politics footing in recent years. Certainly one that gins up a sense of conflict or us against the world. Do you see any indications that that's lessening as China needs the world more, perhaps? Either Lynette or Scott, do you have hope in that front, on the geopolitical front?
Well, I think China has been. During COVID, China tried with a lot of COVID diplomacy, giving out masks and all the COVID-related products to a lot of developing countries, and some of them has received pushback because the qualities varies. China, I think, made a lot of enemies in all parts of the world. It has arrested Japanese scholars, South Korean. There's a huge blockade of Lotte, the big supermart. But recently, he has also patched up his relations with Australia, as well as Canada. The foreign minister of Canada was invited by Wang Yi to visit Beijing last month. So us sitting in Canada thought that the bilateral relations is actually going smoothly for the first time. There's a bit of a turnaround since the arrest of the two Michaels in 2018. But then, just a couple of weeks ago, we have decided to slap 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. So we don't know which directions the bilateral relations are going. So to come back to your questions, I think China has realized that it needs to go out there and make more friends, that its economy needs to, they need to have trade and investment and more bilateral and multilateral relationship going on. But there's also a lot of hurdles because of how politics is going.
Do you see that, Scott?
Sure, yeah. Certainly a variety of different adjustments in their foreign policy the past few years. Wolf warrior language down as a proportion of words from Beijing and from various ambassadors around the world who had a habit of going off every so often, and they've kind of been reined back in. With the United States, we now have around 15 to 16 ongoing dialogues across a range of issues, from AI to nuclear weapons to overcapacity and finance and a bunch of different issues, clarifying what their views are on different things, and essentially, they won't say the word negotiate, but they're negotiating. And then, yes, adjustments with others around the world. I was just in Australia for a few weeks, and Li Qiang had visited in June and essentially declared the relationship normalized. They had, imposed restrictions on wine, lobsters, coal, a variety of products to punish Australia for AUKUS and for calling for a public investigation into COVID. They've withdrawn all those, although they still have restrictions on lobsters. And I think the Portland, Maine lobby must be very powerful in Beijing as relevant. But anyway, they adjusted those policies. But there's still, so the basic foreign policy approach is still in place. Seeing the U.S. and the West as an essential threat, national security, political security, economic. Relations with Russia still tight, and according to folks in D.C., growing. The view that the global order needs to be reformed in a way that's more consistent with what China likes and needs with regard to sovereignty and the role of the state in the economy, et cetera. No admission that there is an overcapacity problem, that there are negative consequences for the rest of the world. Instead, we're all supposed to send China a thank you note for all of the exports. And so, to some extent, this is also a prisoner's dilemma, right? Because you have to also get the United States and others to modify, and I don't know if anyone's been paying attention to D.C. D.C. is not shifting in that direction either. So this is, I don't think we should expect Beijing to unilaterally adjust dramatically without there being a adjustment on the American side. And so we're still, we're pretty locked in.
And we're going to get to audience questions in a second. I wanted to ask Qin, though, what about domestic messaging? And, we've seen in the past China turn up the dial on nationalism when things are not going well. What are you seeing on that front?
Yeah, you're right. It's happening across the population, even the very well-educated population. That is the narrative. And that's why actually it's now hard for us who are based in the US and Canada to conduct research, build connections over there, because any foreigner or any US foreigner from Americans are viewed with suspicion. So that narrative is very much dominating. So one change that could happen is to
tone that down.
Right, yes.
Well, they do that from time to time as well,
yes,
and then
yes.
turn it back up.
Yeah.
I think it's a good time to go to questions. I can always fire back at them, but I'd rather get some questions from the audience. We have quite a few. The very first hand I saw was in the way back.
Two very quick questions. Number one, what is the availability of Paxlovid in the market? Pfizer's Paxlovid for COVID. What's the availability of it now? Is the market changing for it? Second question. What is the thinking in the public mind regarding the source of the COVID virus?
Thank you. Yeah, we didn't actually talk about COVID origins, which is a topic we could spend a whole another hour and a half on. On the medicine front, I kind of assume there's some sort of there's not a huge Paxlovid market, but can you?
Availability.
Yeah, right. I don't know if you guys want to address anything on vaccine. What is available, but if you know, but probably not the area of expertise. But
I can speak. I don't know the answer to your question, but when I was there, again, there was this new wave of COVID, and one of my family members from the US got it for the first time there, and we were saying, okay, get a test, see if it's COVID, and none of the rest of the people who are in China thought it was necessary. So no need to test for COVID. People don't know if they're getting COVID or other kinds of flu or cold, and that's okay. They've accepted it. The way to treat is to rest, drink water, take some flu or cold medicine, and you will be over it. So I don't think many people knows about this medication even.
And the Chinese government's approach on COVID origins, do you want to quickly address that?
My understanding is it came from the food market. Right. I mean, that's what I have read last. That is our understanding in the West, and I think in China, that is still the version that the CCP is propagating.
Right. Next question. Over there.
David Zweig, who I know everybody. Nice to see you all. I had a couple of quick comments and then a question. So the first comment, I think you. Lynette, you should run with your exit voice on loyalty point, because then you get to the question of loyalty and loyalty to Xi. And it was interesting that when you asked what should change, nobody said, well, maybe announce a successor. Don't step down. But I think there's a lot of concern in China and a lot of concern even among young people about the fact that he took on maybe lifetime leadership and hasn't been doing that well. So I think that would be an important thing. One other point, and then the question. One thing that nobody's mentioned, as you talked about the problem of letting COVID loose at the end of 2022, 1 million people died. Nobody's mentioned that. Everybody in China knows somebody who died in that period of time. That's why it's so harsh. That's why, it wasn't just Xi being stupid and letting go. There wasn't everybody, as far as I know, you ask anybody, do you know anybody who died? Everybody knows someone who died within a month or 2 months. My question, Scott, is what about SMEs? So there's the new movement now, go back to the 60 points of 2013. Land, loosen up land sales, right? SMEs, which is a big thing now. And South China Morning Post is doing a study on that.
I don't know if you want to address the loyalty point first, Lynette, or
sure. I mean, that's an excellent point. So I would also follow up your point about death, right? I would add that it's not. You are absolutely right about last month of COVID, everyone has somebody in their family or knows somebody who has died, but it's actually excess death that actually could be prevented. I think that is actually. Yeah, that is actually what changes people's mind and their perception about the capacity of the party to protect them and their families. That this is actually preventable death. Death that they could do much better if they would abandon the policies months ago.
Interesting. And Scott, on SMEs? Or?
Yeah, well, I could say something about SMEs, but also a little bit about the previous question about
small, medium-sized enterprises.
Small, medium-sized companies. But I would say, one of the things that I noticed when I was in China in 2022 is the number of people I encountered who are vaccine hesitant pretty high. And during that period, I also had traveled in the region to China's neighbors. South Korea, Japan, elsewhere, where vaccine hesitancy was very, very low. That trust in the system was pretty high. People were willing to get vaccines, thought they would work, followed instructions, even though they would complain about those things. And you would get taxi drivers in these places. Yes, I've gotten 3 shots, or I've gotten 4, or whatever. And in China, I encountered that and people standing in line to get tested and things like that, but also hesitancy. And they would, and some of those people would cite the same journal articles, the exact same journal articles of people in the United States I know who are vaccine hesitant. They're all reading the same stuff. But it feeds, but it's not just because they're reading stuff from abroad. The anxiety about trust in the system and the medical community and cutting corners and things like that, that was still pervasive then. And so I think, and then you add on to the deaths that were unreported and unrecognized, unmemorialized, and that feeds into that as well. You know, China's economy runs on small, medium-sized enterprises. Although we hear about large SOEs, we hear about you know, even large private companies like Alibaba and Tencent. You know, 95.8% of Chinese companies are actually small and medium-sized, and the incremental sources of growth in employment are from the private sector, these small, medium-sized companies. Li Keqiang, the former premier who's recently passed away, was a huge advocate of essentially just handing money to college graduates to start businesses. It was not necessarily very successful or an efficient way to do it, but it did give them a sense that they could try. And I think they have announced through the Third Plenum and a variety of other statements about the support for small and medium-sized enterprises and access to credit and things. And so you've seen an uptick, a small uptick in the registration of new companies, but it still hasn't grabbed people's attention to say, you know what, we've turned the corner. So I do think that's an exact right place to watch, because they really are the drivers of this economy.
Interesting. Okay, let's get some more questions. Right, you had your hand up, Elizabeth. Go ahead.
Hi, Elizabeth Knupp. I think I have a sort of a complicated set of questions. So I guess the Scott Rozelle-Marty White report is a pretty interesting one, right? So people feel like the system is the problem, not their own lack of energy. And I think Xi Jinping also thinks that the system had a problem, right? That the use of capital, the growth of inequality in the system, and put forward things like common prosperity and his crackdown on the private education sector, I think were all sort of, regardless of how successful they actually were, indicate kind of a view that the society was too unequal and that there were some systemic things that were getting in the way of sort of more equality in the system. And so there's a propaganda narrative also going on in China that is really talking about the inequality of the system. So I'm curious about how much what Scott Rozelle and Marty White learned. It was also partially people are just hearing from their own leaders that their system is unequal and not fair to everyone. And then that sort of gets to these other questions about, there are people who think that Xi Jinping himself doesn't think that economic growth is the most important objective for him as the leader of the country, that he has other objectives, and that he's willing to give up some rapid economic growth in exchange for whether it's political control or reducing inequality or something else like that. So I'm just kind of curious how you all think about this question of inequality, the sort of public propaganda about it, the efforts that she might be sincerely making to improve the inequality system, capitalism, all these questions all rolled together. It's a complicated question.
No, it's a great question.
But anyway, over to you guys.
A great question. I think that's really interesting about how they might be just sort of recapitulating propaganda in some way, absorbing it. I would like to start with Qin on that, because I imagine you've encountered this, or at least some experience with this.
This is such a rich question. Thank you. I always think of Bill Clinton's election slogan, it's the economy, stupid. Is that still true in the US? We can debate that. It's no longer so true in China. So what we've talked about today a lot was the economy declining, affecting people's lives. Is that the top priority for the leader? Probably not. So it's the politics or it's the power. So what is it? We don't quite know, but it's not clearly the economy. And we're trying to solve the economy. We're giving a menu of what can be done, but is that the goal? I doubt it.
And Scott, on the survey, or I think both of you have talked about it, but do you get any sense that there's sort of there's a bit of a feedback loop on the propaganda about inequality in the system? Do you think that might be a factor?
Well, I think you guys are going to need to invite Marty and Scott here for a presentation.
I mean, who
to go into that more detail, and I know they're writing an academic papers, and there will be data that all of us will get to play with, hopefully at some time, for that. But I think that there's there can be different approaches to making things less unequal or more fair. Right, and I think there may be an impression amongst the public, parts of the public, that the policymakers' views about addressing inequality is about soaking the rich and reminding them who's boss. So basically, putting them in their place and taking some of their wealth away, as opposed to other ways that one might address this, which might be rapidly expanding investment in rural education, handing money over to households. There's a whole variety of ways one can address inequality, and they can be more or less effective or more or less acceptable. And so I think that there's some differences of opinion about how to go about that. And I think the sort of fundamental underlying question is, I think people in China thought that there was a social contract. And I think the system's view of what that contract was and the public's view of what that contract was relatively similar. We're going to give up some of our personal freedoms and voice in the system in exchange for this system being run reasonably well and all boats going up. Not rapid, but some kinds of opportunities about things. And I think now it looks like one side has said, you know what, it's now a new social contract. We're going to further restrict voice. We're going to further take opportunities away from you, and we're not going to get as much growth out of it. And I think Chinese people are wondering, you know, what are you offering to us in that new deal, and is it good enough? And so I think there's this ongoing renegotiation of what that social contract is. They're not the only place trying to, in the middle of renegotiating the social contract. We are obviously doing it. We are a deeply divided country, which, and some folks think that many people think it needs to be renegotiated or just blown up. And we have no idea exactly what it will yield. So we're actually two societies, and maybe there's many societies in the midst of renegotiating their social contracts.
So maybe it's let some people get less rich first. We have a lot of questions. So here, over there, you had your question up from early on. Go ahead. This guy here.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. One, my takeaway from this is basically that the people of China are sort of sitting on their hands. And in response, the government has basically made a series of pronouncements. Are there any green shoots that are appearing on the horizon that are taking hold that may have some sort of effect on it? And if not, what is the political risk that China just sort of meanders around and doesn't really go anywhere?
Who wants to take that one?
Let me start, if I could. First, I think I mentioned EVs, clean tech. That is all driven by the Chinese private sector, and there are a variety of different areas in AI. I met with a bunch of Chinese AI companies. It was organized, this dinner that I went to, by the Stanford Graduate School of Business, because they all went to Stanford. and it is impressive, these potential areas of economic success. I guess the other thing that oddly makes me think that there will be a change at a fork in the road that leads to differences is all of the complaining that we encounter, all of the unhappiness is a sign that 40+ years of reform and opening really permeated the society. These folks want an economy that works. They want to be connected with the rest of the world. They are very well informed. These are not people who can be tricked and just led down some path. That is very impressive. And that they have the willingness and the courage to talk to Qin Gao and to me and to others when the consequences of saying the wrong thing are high. Those are things that give me, that inspire me, that think that China's direction is not written down, that the current trajectory is going to shift, because these people do not want to be like North Korea. They don't want it to be a closed society. And so at some point, and so they're holding the line. And so the pilot light for reform and opening and a different society, that's still burning quite brightly, I think.
You guys are welcome to jump in. Go ahead.
That's an excellent point. And I think one way to think about it is, I think the economic pie has been growing in the last 30 or 40 years or so. And people at the bottom and emerging knows that they are getting an unfair proportion of the pie. But the pie was still growing, so people were fine about that. But now that the pie has stopped growing or is shrinking in many ways, people start questioning who makes the decision about distribution of the pie, which is why you contrast various rounds of surveys that Marty White and Scott Rozelle have done. People know that income distribution has always been the problem, but I'm still getting, my income level is still increasing, so it's fine. But when it's stagnating, then you go back and question the prerogative of the decision makers, which is the system itself. I think there's a backward thinking involved.
Just following up, do you see any political risk that's associated with it? I mean, it sounds to me like they're all doing that. But is there real risk? In other words, are the people going to say, we're at a point where we waited long enough?
Sure. So in the interest of time, so I study protests. You ask me about risk, I'm always say that there's going to be risk involved. But I think to put things in context, there's always been risk. Risk of toppling the regime? No, I don't see. Risk of social unrest here and there? There's always been. And people would think that under Xi Jinping there's no protest, but the contrary was actually true. There's actually more protests these days, larger scale and more pluralistic type of grievances compared to before.
Right, and there have always been lots of protests, actually. All right, more questions. You had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, I have a question for Scott. You mentioned early in the talk overinvestment. Thanks, being a problem. I know a lot of the conversation around overcapacity is often around solar panels and electric vehicles. Are there other sectors that you're watching that you think are particularly consequential that currently are seeing overinvestment? And what are those sectors, and what are the main consequences that you're seeing of that? Perhaps you already touched on that with like inefficiency, but curious if you could speak more to that.
Sure. It's hard to go one by one. Chinese statistics on this are reasonably okay, and we really don't have great alternative sources. But overall, capacity utilization rates is right now, people say somewhere between 75 and 80% is, if you're below 75%, then you're in overcapacity, right? And over the past year, we've seen the overall capacity utilization rate go down into low 70s, and then in some sectors be in the 60s. And so automobiles is in that range now, in the 60s. But you'll also see that perhaps in shipping. And you don't see it yet in semiconductors because they're just in the middle of building new fabs. But once these fabs come online, I think we'll see that there as well. And of course, fab capacity is being expanded, not just in China, but in Japan, the EU, Brazil, the United States, Taiwan, South Korea. So there's a variety of sectors in China where this occurs. If you want like the best economic analysis of what this means in China and implications, the Undersecretary for International Affairs for the U.S. Treasury Department, Jay Shambaugh, gave a speech on July 10th about China's overcapacity problem and the consequences for the rest of the world and what it means relative to exports. I think this is, in China it's very controversial because it's framed as an international issue, but if you just look at it as a domestic economy issue, in China there's a recognition right now there's too much supply and not sufficient demand. There's a debate about whether it's just too much is being produced or why has demand not been there? And this conversation's mostly been about the demand side.
Right. I want to do speed round here because there's tons more questions, and I want to get to as many as I can. Right here.
Thank you. I do have a question about, so I think a lot of the discussion we have today is based on the condition that the Chinese economy is not growing as fast as it used to be, or maybe it's slowing down or decreasing. So I'm just wondering, so do you think that, we know economic goes up and down, if the pie is increasing again, then would the kind of people would go back to the old type of thinking that they have gained trust in the government again? Or do you think that COVID has actually made the Chinese people pass the bridge of no return, that there is a systemic trend that people will no longer trust the government again? Thank you.
Why don't you each give a very quick answer where you think we've gone past the point of no return?
I think there's always a way to return, and there should be, because the Chinese people deserve better. Everyone I met told me some COVID death, suffering-related stories. That's not going to go away. So the Chinese government has a lot to do to gain back the trust and respect, and to make people believe they care about them. And one way to make that happen is to, again, build the economy, let people live better.
Anyone want to add anything?
I think it's possible to gain back the trust, but it's challenging. There's a fundamental different set of thinking on the economy, on politics. The system needs to change, and I'm not sure people at the top has the courage to give up power in order to change.
Anyone who travels to China, you were there all summer, whatever, compared to where they were, even compared to 10 years ago, amazing amount of progress. So this is an expectations issue. It's about what could they achieve versus what they are achieving and potential. And China, in some ways, suffered from irrational exuberance for so long that to reconfigure expectations to get the rational level of exuberance or unexuberance, that's what they're going through. Yes, it's possible. They've not figured out how to do it yet.
If they bring some of that corruption back, they'll get more of that exuberance. Right over there.
Hi. Was listening to a great podcast, your colleague Scott, Jude Blanchett, David Hoffman earlier this week, and they were talking about how when we hear 改革开放, we hear reform, in the Western mind we think KFC, McDonald's coming to China, we have a very good idea of like what reform means, but maybe in Xi Jinping's mind, reform means something else. It is reforming the state. He came to power in a very hotly behind-the-scenes contested, you were there, Gady, Boisilai, lots were happening. We need to reform the entire mechanisms for the party to maintain stability. Reform, 改革, means something different. So, one, any comments or thoughts on when Xi Jinping says 改革开放, it is, deepening comprehensive reform was, so many, it was all over the third plenum's decision. Is that what you think about that? Are there any other concepts when the Chinese government talks to itself about things that we're really not understanding here on the Upper East Side? That it's not making it over kind of in space and time, and we might be misunderstanding or not fully grasping what they're thinking.
What do you think?
Very briefly, I think reform meant to us and others, and Chinese officials in the past, liberalization, withdrawal of states, the party states' operations into daily life of people and the economy and society. And that's what people measured. And liberalization and international meant adapting China, integrating it into the existing international institutions and norms and rules. And now we can see that what they mean by reforms now are improving on the party states' control and management of society, and internationally getting the world to be more accepting and connected with China on China's terms.
Oh, wait, we have like 2.5 minutes left, so really speed round. Alec in the back.
Thanks. Alec Ash, I work here at Asia Society. So my question is to ask the panel to indulge in a counterfactual, a what-if question, sort of what we could have done differently, which is easier than making a prediction. We talked of how maybe spring 22 was the inflection point where they could have let Omicron in and eased off zero COVID. Lynette Ong also mentioned that for the 2 years previous to that, China was looking pretty good. I can attest to that. I lived in China during the pandemic, and there was a real sense of triumphalism, both in society and economically, with the V-shaped curve. So what could China have done differently? What if, instead of zero COVID, right from the beginning, it was a Western model of let's let it in and try to manage rather than to have zero cases? Or what if spring 22, they'd let Omicron in? Would anything that they had done differently have avoided these negative consequences? Or is it a lose-lose situation, inevitable?
Tough one to do in a minute. Who wants? One of you gets to answer.
Well, less triumphalism, less nationalism, and to come back to your point about Xi Jinping's economic strategy. I see his strategy as one of picking winners. If you are familiar with the East Asian economic miracle type of terminology. It's not about liberal economic reform anymore. It's not about letting the market decide who the winners are and sort of the winners and the losers, but more about who the CCP thinks is going to win. And right now it's EV. And next decade, it may be something else. So the party is actively, I think, making the decision in how to allocate resources.
I think I'm going to let each of you, this is going to have to maybe the end of our questions, I'm sorry to say. They were great questions. I wish we could get to more. So I'm going to let each of you answer this or give closing remark as your answer.
Okay, just 30 seconds. Absolutely, they could have done something very different. They could have let in mRNA vaccines. They could have expanded facilities for treatment of those who were sick, Paxlovid, a bunch of other different things. They could have been just generally more transparent about what the data showed about cases and sickness and things like that. That would have given people a lot more confidence that they were going through this together rather than by themselves. And I think that would have then made the rebound post-COVID, it would have been a better, stronger economic boost. And they would have been said that they would have been able to claim rightly that they had tackled this problem much better than everybody else.
And Qin, did you see that kind of wish that they had done things differently from the people you talked to, that this could have all been done better?
No. No one was in a position to do such a thing or say such a thing. So
right.
No.
Yeah.
You want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think we talked about COVID today, but it's not about COVID. It's really about the political system that's being tested by this extreme case of COVID, but could be tested by something else. So we are at a crossroads, and I think the Chinese people and the Chinese leaders know it. What will happen next will need our attention, and maybe some of our prescriptions could help. Thanks.
So we close on a point that's a sort of a version of one of the Economist's most famously lampooned headlines, which was Indonesia at a crossroads, which was cited in The Simpsons. So China's at a crossroads, and I think that's a good place to end. Thank you so much to all of you and to everybody.